Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Storytects, where imagination meets structure and where stories aren't just told, they are built. I'm Ralph Lucchese, and today we are going to dive into one of the minds of the most influential architects or storytects of the modern transmedia storytelling universe. Today's guest and the first guest of Storytects is a creative force whose work has helped define some of the biggest entertainment franchises on the planet. He's been behind the narrative architecture of global entertainment franchises such as Pirates of the Caribbean, Avatar, Men in Black, Amazing Spider-Man 2, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Halo, Hot Wheels, Transformers, Dexter, my personal favorite, Turok. His collaborations span industry giants like Disney, 20th Century Fox Pictures, Microsoft, Mattel, Hasbro, Ubisoft, and Nickelodeon, while guiding the expansion of these universes across film, television, video games, and more. Recently, he's been at the forefront of revitalizing Ultraman for the North American audiences, playing a key role in the development of Ultraman Rising on Netflix, and serving as a transmedia producer for Subaraya Productions. And if I get that wrong, I'm sure he will correct me, helping to introduce this legendary hero to a whole new generation of people. So whether he's crafting immersive story worlds, building mythology Bibles for franchises like Halo, or working on groundbreaking projects with the Walt Disney Company, his influence is felt across the entertainment landscape. Jeff Gomez, welcome to Storytects.
Wow, Ralph, that was a terrific introduction. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. You know, we try to do that over here. We try to craft the story as well as possible so the viewer has a decent understanding. I think anybody that goes into a creative, and in this case, a transmedia world, your name gets thrown around a lot. And by a lot, you have Henry Jenkins and then you have Jeff Gomez, essentially. So as a pioneer of the transmedia universe, it's an honor to have this conversation with you, and I appreciate you coming on the show. I do want to dive into it. I think there's a lot to unpack and a lot to unfold, especially with transmedia storytelling. But before we do that, I kind of want to jump into pivotal moments in your childhood where Jeff Gomez sat back and was like, you know what, this transmedia world, transmedia storytelling, or even just storytelling in general, when you knew that was your calling growing up? Were there any stories or worlds, story worlds that completely captivated you, something that made you think, you know what, one day in the future, I want to build worlds like this? How did those early inspirations shape your approach to storytelling today?
A story that I didn't haven't told too much is the fact that because of the level of chaos that was going on around me, and because I had a kind of obsessive compulsive mind, I needed a technique to kind of restore order, to kind of have the world make sense for me, even though, you know, every day brought with it some kind of shocking surprise, sort of like what's going on today for all of us. So I invented MTV, monster television. As a young child, getting dressed in the morning and getting ready to go to school, I would talk to myself, and I'd be kind of an announcer, the way that on ABC television there'd be a guy who would tell you what's next on the channel that night and so forth. So I would kind of dramatically fashion what was going to happen next, and I dress it up with the fact that Godzilla will be appearing, or that Gigantor or Kimba the White Lion was going to guest star. So here I was creating a kind of metaverse for myself, where my favorite characters, also who happen to be kind of strong and confident characters from all the cartoons and movies that I loved, were going to be spending the day with me and intervening somehow and making sure that I'm okay, and so forth. And so every single day I would tell myself an epic story. I gotta tell you, Ralph, it never really has stopped.
It's been added to the portfolio for sure. And again, not to sit here and kind of glaze over it, but you worked on everything from Avatar to Pirates of the Caribbean. As a kid, you worked on Halo. For me, my personal favorite, Turok. So clearly, you're doing something or did something that raised the eyebrows of all these IPs. One thing in particular, and one IP in particular, Magic the Gathering, which now I'd never played Magic the Gathering. I was more of a Pokemon kid myself. But I grew up knowing about Magic the Gathering, and I'm more from a creative perspective, right? So I'm, and this is me assuming. I read a couple things about your involvement with it, but a lot of the stuff happens in your head, right? Any creative person knows that everything starts up here, and then it's a creative's job to take it from here and put it into a visual component or an audio component, so on and so forth. The stuff that you've created and written about has turned into $1 billion franchise, at least from the beginning, and however they've adapted it to now. Can you take me through that structure, that process that you have? Not everybody has it. I've spoken to a lot of producers, writers, a few Transmedia producers, one that we'll have who was a mentor of mine in upcoming episodes. And it seems that everybody has a different approach to it, but you have one approach that seems to work, for lack of a better term, that really gathers the eyes of all this big, heavy-hitting IP. So can you take me through what that process looks like for you? And in this instance, Magic the Gathering, and we'll use that as kind of like a base point, like the foundation of how you got that from point A all the way up to what it is today.
The fun thing about talking to you, Ralph, is that I'm going to get a little technical.
I love it.
In
Bring it
terms
on.
of the process. Think of it as if I mean, I know nothing about cars or the way that car engines work, but even as early as Magic the Gathering, I had a very good sense, a strong sense of how narrative worked, and not just about the basics of story structure, but how story iterated itself from prehistoric times all around the world into the kind of didactic narratives that helped people to survive, and then the kind of mythic narratives that helped people to aspire to be something greater than themselves, and then into narratives like novels and movies and even interactive narratives. A narrative form that I was very strong in by the 1990s, which is when I went out for the Magic license for Acclaim Entertainment, was the narratives involved in role-playing games, adventure games, tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons.
Which you have, no mean to cut you off, which you've also had your hands on as well, if that is that correct?
I did some
Dungeons and Dragons.
tabletop game design when I was younger in the 80s, and certainly was well known in the role-playing game community, which is why I bonded with the people, the principals at Wizards of the Coast, because they came out of the adventure game community too. But this was going to be a challenge because they were in a hurry. They knew that Acclaim, Valiant Comics and Acclaim Entertainment, which can create comic books and video game content out of the Magic cards, they knew that that would be an accelerant to the creation of a fantasy world, a universe in which all of these characters in the card game existed. I certainly envisioned that as a possibility for them, and they agreed. So in opening up the hood of the Magic engine, first of all, I learned that the owners of the intellectual property were a little bit esoteric. They were very progressive, young people. They were, kind of politically kind of far to the left. They wanted, strong female characters, an array of diverse kinds of characters in their story world, and they were into kind of high fantasy. Um, uh, so so that they asked this of me, and I was kind of a Dungeons and Dragons, grinder, epic clashes between good and evil, and all that sort of thing. So I knew that I could not assert my personal narrative onto their universe, their world. They had needs that I needed to respond to, and at first that was a little daunting. But then I remembered, how I developed my Dungeons and Dragons game in the first place, which attracted these heavy metal dudes from the park who hung out drinking beers and listening to rock music, on boom boxes in the 1970s and 80s. I had to speak their language in order to get them involved with my fantasy universe, my Dungeons and Dragons game. So I did that again, and this is the key. Um, uh, I wasn't there to pull the engine out of Wizards of the Coast's product, their brand, and replace it with mine. That would have been the fastest way for them to say, please leave. um, so my job was to take apart their engine and completely and fully understand it, because it may need some tweaking in order to sell hundreds of thousands of comic books, or a mass market video game. Those are just the facts of life. So the first thing I had to do was to understand the philosophy of Magic the Gathering. So that meant sitting down with the people who created the rules, and when you dug deep enough, there was mathematics, recombinatorial algebra was the thing that Richard Garfield used to create this elegant card game system, right? That allowed for the rules of Magic the Gathering. And then Scaff Elias, the other game designer of Magic, he was interested in how to convey magic in this in the universe of the card game, and those were the 5 colors, which intrinsically bound with one another. They were interlocked like a system that held the Magic universe together. It held the game together, and in my mind, that meant it holds the universe together, as opposed to a binary, like light and dark sides of the Force in Star Wars. There's a kind of pentacle of colors, the 5 colors. And so the conflict of Magic is built on a universe struggling to evolve. So to a degree, battle was necessary, the dueling aspects of Magic, as a necessary component to that natural world. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So just to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying, it's because it's more than just, like you were saying, the binary back and forth. By having those 5 or 6, or in this case, the 5 colors, as you're saying, combating at the same time, it's more than just the fight. There's layers to it. There's different elements to it that allows the story to, one, expand. It allows it to live within its elements as itself, but it then allows you as the consumer, as the audience, to then branch off, and if you like this story side of it, piggyback off that and build your own that way, while the actual story world itself isn't drastically affected, or isn't affected at all, because we're playing within the rules of the game. Is that
100%? So good, Ralph. Thank you. That's great. That's
Thank
great.
you.
Super cool. So then the challenge for me is to understand philosophically what each of those colors represented. And to their credit, they had a lot of ideas about what that was. It wasn't necessarily implemented in fiction because there hadn't been much Magic the Gathering fiction before then. So if I had to make a clear contribution to early Magic, it was the fact that I introduced attention in that I was having the characters becoming aware that there were ways to resolve these conflicts without devastating one another. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And to a degree, that was me synergizing off of Wizards of the Coast. Wizards of the Coast were progressive, and yet they made this game about destroying one another, dueling.
It's contrasting viewpoints in its
Very
core.
contrasting, and it's weird because they were almost, I sensed a discomfort with that contrast. You know,
Now, would you say that? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
sure,
Would
sure.
would you say that's obviously? I'm not going to sit here and say that their lack of storytelling knowledge, but we have progressive, that mindset of always moving forward, but they're caught in this binary storytelling world. So their lack of knowledge, in this instance, I'm gonna say lack of knowledge. Just know that it's not coming from a malicious
No,
or a
and
malintent place, but their inability to see past the typical structure of story that everybody's so commonly versed to, that was holding them back. Would you say that's a fair assessment, at least in that
well,
regard?
the, it's funny. It felt at times like they were uncomfortable with their own fundamental premise.
Oh, I see.
Right?
Yeah.
So here were a small set of game designers who built a game where you fundamentally were required to kill your opponent, to destroy your opponent, and yet there were hundreds of people at Wizards of the Coast who were progressive, peace-loving people who wanted to resolve, the world's problems, and also they had become really rich really fast. All of them. There's profit sharing in early Wizards of the Coast. So actually, that was wonderful because I felt the same way, secretly and privately in the 1990s. I wished that there were interesting and engaging ways to resolve fundamental conflicts without annihilating your enemy, without the endless a kind of hero's journey clash of good and evil that usually resulted in good winning and evil going away for a little while and then coming back and doing it again. I was intuiting that concept wasn't necessarily healthy for humanity as we progressed into a more and more technologically networked civilization. So the solution was this notion of reconciliation. How do we reconcile these five colors? How do people attempt at least to solve their problems without completely destroying one another?
You're reverse engineering the equation, essentially.
There you go. Exactly. And this is illustrated in some of my early storytelling. I wanted to resolve the Ice Age, which is one of the earliest major narratives in Magic the Gathering, without necessarily, having entire races be destroyed and so forth. And I figured out, a story to tell that tale. And it's Freyalise, one of the great green characters, this goddess, planeswalker character, comes up with a spell that can break the world free of the ice, and this is done so by coming to terms with characters from all five of the color representations. The philosophical system of Magic the Gathering resolved itself in order for that spell, the world spell, to be launched and be successful. And Wizards of the Coast really liked that idea, and it became part of a comic book series and video games and things like that. So I'm hoping that Legendary Pictures, which now has this Transmedia Magic the Gathering universe, that they pick up on this as a basis for their narrative. The fact that the default, yes, is conflict between these philosophical systems and lands and colors, but that ultimately reconciliation is going to be necessary, or else everyone is annihilated.
Yeah, so it's through the levels. There's a big story, but then those micro stories in between is really where it's more impactful. My my question, I didn't think we were going to talk this much about Magic the Gathering. I'm actually excited that we got to kind of see where it came from, from a creative sense. One last question in regards to that. So, since your input on the story world itself, has it changed over the course of how many years? Have they adapted, or has it been essentially the same, or at least the basis from the beginning? And have they, from that point on, still created characters, still created storylines and story arcs, but used the original, we'll call it the story Bible in this case, but
Sure,
the original rules?
Well, it involved many years and some heartbreak. There was a period where a lot of my narratives were kind of decanonized. So,
Okay.
there was a period of time where Wizards of the Coast kind of unofficially said, well, those stories in the comics didn't really take place that way, and all that sort
Mm.
of thing. But time heals all wounds, right? 20 years later, there are so many people who are even at Wizards of the Coast who look back nostalgically because the comics or games and so forth introduced them to the world and so forth. So I got recanonized.
That's funny.
And Jared Carthalion, the Shadow Mage, one of the very first characters I created, a kind of projection of myself, my personality, my appearance, and so forth into the Magic universe, is now a mighty planeswalker who was involved in some of the more recent events in the Magic universe, and that's awesome.
That's really cool. It actually kind of plays into my next kind of solid group of questions. As a creative, I put a lot of myself into it, whether they're insecurities. I like to put a lot of what's going on in my life into the stories I'm creating, the stories I'm crafting. And for you to say that this character was compromised of you essentially, and now it's out there in the universe, I'm curious, in these other franchises that you were a part of, how true was that for you to extend yourself? Like, which, maybe a better question would be, the characters that you helped craft and create in these story worlds, like let's use Halo or Torok. Better yet, let's use Torok. How much of an influence is that on a game like Torok, the storyline of Torok, and ultimately got it to be where it is today? And now they're turning Torok, they're creating a new game for it and
Yeah,
everything like
yeah.
that. But it's coming from you. It's coming from within. So how much of you is actually left in these characters from start to finish?
Sure. Turok was tricky because certainly I was drawing upon my love of dinosaurs and a fantasy world I had created as a child. It was called Planet D. And I took ideas from that and put it into Turok, but even more to Turok 2, including the Primogen, the villain of the piece, was snatched right out of Planet D for me, the name and everything. But otherwise, it was more in terms of infusing myself philosophically as a game designer into Turok than it was character and so forth. The Turok games were based on a comic book character, Turok Dinosaur, Turok Son of Stone, and then at Valiant it was called Turok Dinosaur Hunter, and there wasn't all that much room for character development, storyline stuff, and so forth in those early Nintendo 64 video games. So I saw myself in terms of the projection of a story world that seemed to be alive around you. You know, where dinosaurs could come from any way, and it felt a little bit like you can go in any direction, and so forth. It was crude, but more possible than it had ever been. And that's how kind of my persona manifested in those games. Now, if you really want to talk personality and me, you jump forward, you know, about 7 or 8 years and go to Hot Wheels, the Transmedia universe of Hot Wheels. Began for me with the manifestation of myself. I didn't know much about race cars and racing, as I told you before, but I wanted these 5 characters. The requirement, the engine told me there needed to be 5 teams totaling 35 cars, because that's what Mattel wanted to advertise with this property to the entire world. So there would need to be 5 team leaders who each were leading 7 cars. And I said, well, I need for each of these teams to be meaningful to me. So there needs to be an aspect of myself in each of the leaders. So I divided myself into 5. And those were the 5 leaders of the Hot Wheels cars. And that was awesome, because the stakes were high for me. I cared so much about those characters, and that the aspect of that personality helped to inform the personality of the team, and so that was imparting myself into that. Then there's also this notion of reconciliation, which infuses everything I do. Toward the end of the narrative, they had to team up in order to solve the greater crisis of the animated series. So instead of just beating each other, you know, competing with each other so that there's a loser, they had to kind of get together to win.
That's very cool. It's like the triumph, like a movie that stands out, like because the way you're saying it like that is like Inside Out. I'm sure you've seen Inside Out, where it's each emotion, and at the end, it's all about teaming up together and they conquer the beast, essentially.
A lot of contemporary Disney animation focuses on that. Moana, you know, the Pixar films. A lot of them have this kind of multi-perspective reconciliation narrative, which I think has been very successful for them.
Oh yeah, and it's layered. And for you to relate it to the Hot Wheels universe, how was that? Right, so each 5 team essentially is a piece of you. So when crafting the narrative, I'm going to try to work through this with you on the pod. So for those listening, know that this is a pure original thought, trying to work through it with Jeff Gomez. But so each individual, we do the 5. Each beating each other throughout it. From a creative side, right, they're cars and whatever the elements are. But from a personal side, that's you, right? That's 1/5 of you, 1/5 of you, 1/5 of you. So the dynamic of this one beating the other one, let's just say happiness beating negativity, for argument's sake here. How was that experience, getting to mess around with those stories, putting yourself into those? Like, did you feel like there was a sense on your own side, not only from the Hot Wheels universe, but from yourself going, you know what, like, were the events based on things going on in your life at that time, which then helped craft the way the narrative was being shaped and the direction that it was going?
Sure, a little bit.
Am I making sense? Do you see where I'm going with that?
Of course, of course. Yeah. But then, Ralph, you're dealing with the tension of the business of being in production with a company like Mattel, which has its own agenda, with a company like Mainframe Entertainment, which is now Rainmaker. They're the animation company, with my co-creator, Fabian Nicieza, who is a fantastic comic book writer and animation writer and so forth. So I couldn't be too precious with these various aspects of myself. I had to let other people play in the playground. and meet the needs of Mattel. But still, Banji Castillo was Puerto Rican and had Puerto Rican mannerisms. That was very unusual for a cartoon character in the year 2002. um, and Taro Kitano was Japanese and knew karate and so forth, and embodied that aspect of myself, my love for Japanese culture, my my love for martial arts and so forth. So it was fun having them kind of knock heads with each other, and yet have this kind of underlying warmth. To this day, I have hundreds of fans who write me and engage with me with an adoration for Hot Wheels World Race, that animated series. And a lot of that, I feel, is because of the underlying warmth, the fact that these characters, got to love each other as the narrative progressed and came to terms with one another, even though they talked trash and competed along the way. And I'm kind of proud of that.
That's awesome. It sounds like Hot Wheels, I don't want to say it was the pinnacle, but something about it changed the way you thought about storytelling and potentially transmedia storytelling. And if that's not true, was there a project that changed the way you went about storytelling, creating these worlds, going into new projects? For myself, I know every time I start a new project, by the end of it, I go, all right, what did I learn? What am I not going to do again? What will I do again? But ultimately, like, when's that shift? So for
Sure.
here, it sounds like with Hot Wheels, there was, even to this day in 2025, there was such an impact on you that I would say it's safe to assume that that was a moment in time where Jeff stood up and said, all right, like, totally different concepts now. Let's move on to bigger, better projects. What project came after Hot Wheels?
Sure. Um, uh, you know, there's never, this key moment where the heavens open up. um, Everything's a process. Everything evolves. So for Magic, that was extremely stressful. I was always at my wit's end, trying to contend with hundreds of problems that would crop up, in any given week, and hold on for dear life. Hot Wheels, you're right, in a way, was the first time that a company came to me, put the baby in my hands, and had faith in me. Run with this, Gomez. And yet I was still, sort of doing improv jazz, making it up as I was going along, with this general structural notion for what a transmedia narrative could be. But I didn't even have that word yet. Transmedia occurred to me in the next project, Pirates of the Caribbean with Disney, and that was a scenario where I had to, the intellectual property was forbidding. I hadn't even seen Pirates of the Caribbean before, being brought in on that project, and then it wasn't necessarily my thing as a movie, and yet it's Walt Disney Company saying, come here and do what you did for Hot Wheels, but for Pirates of the Caribbean, across all our different divisions and so forth. So that was the first time I opened up a tool set, formalizing the tools that I had been using on Magic and Hot Wheels, and applying that to something that actually was tough for me. What is the essence of Pirates of the Caribbean? What is what are the mechanisms that made it work as a movie? What were the legacy mechanisms that made it work as a ride, right? Because it was a theme park ride. and what is going to hold over to movie 2 and movie 3, which were just getting underway as production is concerned at that time. So that's where it really started to become technique. That's where it really started to become something that that was a mixture, a true mixture of creativity and business savvy, understanding for brand, and things like that.
You have to wear the creative hat, but you also have to keep the business hat on at the same time.
Sure.
Which, as a creative, I'm sure you know, sometimes it's tough to do because you want to, everything on its above and beyond. You want to just explore and go
At the
crazy.
time, it was the last thing I wanted to do. But they're Disney. They're going to be tough negotiators and hard on us. You know, they will tell us do this job, which means navigating the entire Disney company all around the world, and running into resistance everywhere we went.
Interesting.
And being told by Oren Aviv, the chief creative officer, I don't care that you're running into resistance, get the job done.
Interesting. So you got to create a strategy essentially to work with and partner with these brands, and in this case franchises, just to make it work. It almost seems it also kind of seems, and I'm at the base levels of Transmedia, right? I've done a little things here and there just on my own projects and how I would take a script, turn into a movie, a potential adaptation into a podcast, so on and so forth. But working with these brands and franchises, I can't imagine the struggle of getting everybody on the same creative page, because I almost feel like there's this element of, like, Jeff Gomez was hired to do a job, and there's almost this sense of, I don't want to say resentment, but this sense of maybe envy or jealousy.
Oh, it was, who are even you?
I see.
I don't know you. I wasn't even told you were going to show up today. There was a lot of that.
But you have a job to do.
Yeah.
You have to figure it out.
Oh, but there were techniques. The number one technique, Ralph, is having no fear about how much work needed to be done. Okay, so much of what you encounter in the corporate world is, to minimize the amount of work that you have to do.
Oh yeah,
and so forth. So when we showed up, we said, look, here's what's required of your division and of your interaction with this intellectual property.
Wow.
We will do as much of this work as you want us to do, and we will give you all the credit.
Wow. It takes a special person to do that, though, because there's no such thing as ego at that point, at least on your side, where you're doing a lot of the legwork. And
the employer knows. Oren Aviv knew what our job was.
Understood.
So if the result was going to be a good Pirates of the Caribbean product, then we've done our job.
Yeah.
Right? So that's number one. And number two, we'd file reports. Here's what got done. And there'd be a little tiny JG at the bottom of our reports. So they knew who it was coming from. And I'd be objective and give credit where credit was due, but here are the actions that were taken. So that's all you need. Never worrying about ascribing credit to whoever it was that we were working with. And they deserved credit for accepting this knucklehead into their division, right? So it really worked out, and that was the way that we have done our job ever since. When it comes to collaborative situations, when it comes to originating our own intellectual property, that's a slightly different story, and really some stuff that we're really proud of. But when you're taking somebody else's brand and being responsible for defending and protecting it as it develops across all these different divisions, you have to play it that way.
Have you ever gotten to a franchise or a project like this where they didn't really have any sort of rules or story Bible or anything like that, where it was one of those, like, look, we threw a bunch of stuff at a wall and it worked, and now we're forced to do this. I'm kind of maybe I want to translate this more because I know you had a lot to do with the Halo's mythology Bible, and the creation of that. I believe it was Halo 3 to Reach or something along those lines. So my question is, when being approached by a company like that, from a story creator or from a story side, like when you're doing a script, right? We have our character descriptions and, we have our beat sheets and things like that. When you're working with like a video game franchise and they're like, all right, here we go. We tried an idea for a game. It worked. Number 2 worked even better. Number 3, it's outstanding. We don't have a Bible. We have nothing there. It's just a bunch of these characters. What goes into that on your side of the house where you get approached by a company like that or part of a world like that, and they go, hey, we got to craft this livable, breathable thing that the fandom can go to and always resort back to. But then on the flip side, we can utilize it for future projects over and over and over again because we have a basis and the foundation for the true story.
If you were to talk about the moment where Starlight Runner truly became Starlight Runner, it was with a proprietary Transmedia development and production process. It was with Halo. There were a few reasons for that. Number one, forming an agreement with Microsoft with what would become 343 Studios. It was Microsoft Game Studios, I think, at that time. The way that they work their contracts is extremely detailed, and like more so, like exponentially more than anything we'd ever seen before. So in order to negotiate with them, we had to distill our process for the very first time to actually list our process. Why? Because we own that process. They don't. So we had to distinguish what it was that we needed to walk away with.
Now, when you say own that process and it's proprietary, can you expand on that a little bit more? I understand the contents of the words. I understand what it means to own a process. But when you're saying proprietary, are you saying this is something that you guys have moved on to a utility patent process? Like, what do you mean by actually owning it to the extent of then having to spell it out in contract negotiations and things like that?
Sure. There is a process of thought that goes into, for example, the deconstruction of a fictional universe.
Okay.
Right? And that is protectable. We call it the action drive system. It's a trademark. It is our internal process for deconstructing a gigantic piece of fiction and discerning what the most essential qualities of that fictional world are so that they can be extended into all these different media. That's the secret, Ralph, to transmedia storytelling. It has to feel like that world when you visit it across these different platforms. It doesn't have to tell the same story, doesn't have to contain the same characters, and yet your experience of it has to be awesome. A little bit like the Skeleton Crew Star Wars series that was just on Disney Plus, right? There were almost no characters from other Star Wars movies and TV shows in that miniseries. And yet, more than most things that have been on Disney Plus, it kind of felt like Star Wars. And that's because those people, perhaps as opposed to the Acolyte, the people who made Skeleton Crew had a fundamental, even if it's intuitive, understanding of the essence of the Star Wars brand and the Star Wars universe. So you call us in if you want that, if you want to know what exactly it is that's lightning in a bottle, that can then be carried to these other media platforms, you call us. So we documented that for Microsoft, and they said, "Oh, okay, got it, great. Here's the money. Go,
Let's see.
go do it."
So why, to kind of piggyback off of that concept, and I can't believe I'm about to segue somehow into Lord of the Rings, but here we are. Um, why? And I want to be careful how I word this, but there's certain companies, and like you would think, like a company like Amazon that has a hold of the Rings of Power. Um, Now, for granted, I enjoyed the Rings of Power, and we had discourse about this on a previous call, but then one of the main reasons why is because I think they did an outstanding job at crafting Sauron as a character.
Mhm.
They make Sauron freakishly likable, like, and when I mean freakishly, like everything about him you shouldn't like, and you do like. At least how I when I watch it, I'm like, I can't believe I like this guy. They made him incredibly awesome for a narcissist, evil person. Then you read all this story about how they got it so wrong. Rings of Power, that is.
Sure.
And I've read the Silmarillion like 18 times, and I'm probably going to revisit it again because there's obviously parts in the Silmarillion that just don't explain it, right? They don't break down Sauron's character to that extreme, and
Mhm.
Galadriel and Celebrimbor, so on and so forth. But the amount of hate that's on the internet for it, I'm having a hard time kind of understanding, because I get the story world. I understand Middle Earth. That's one project that, I'm starting Storytects and really trying to hone in on story, because that's a dream of mine, to just work within that IP and build these stories and craft stories within the Middle Earth universe. But everybody thinks they got it so wrong. And I'm trying to find out how and where, because the Silmarillion, for what it is, like, it's the basis there, sure, but it I think people need to have the understanding, or some sort of basis of understanding, that a lot of the stuff that's in there isn't going to be in the Silmarillion. And in order for the world to continue to move on, and in order to adapt, you have to have those additions and new characters implemented in order to build it. But it's getting so much hate. So I'm just curious, from someone that's coming from the transmedia side that can see it, that I'm sure may or may, I'm going to assume here, you aren't a fan. Um, Maybe what could they do better? What is it that where they lacked? Why it's getting such a negative review for the people, but they're still continuing to do it. They're still moving on, and they're potentially making the 5 seasons out of it. So I don't know. Just I know it's a gaggle of word vomit there, but I'm curious to get your input on that.
Ralph, let's lay the cards out, man. Um, uh, I failed. I failed to persuade Amazon to hire me and get it right. And here's why I failed. I sat in a conference room with members of my team, executives at Amazon, and there might have been one or two of the showrunners in the room, and they wanted us. They said, there's such a vast quantity of information that needs to be collated and turned into something that that hundreds of people can understand about this story world and about this particular period of time in Middle Earth. Excuse me. That we need you guys, and I said, fantastic. What are we basing our content on? Because I'm thinking the entire body of Tolkien's work, and they said, of course, no, no, no. In fact, we only have a sliver of the canon that we can operate in.
Oh, so
And
it's very technical based.
that's right. And yet we want all these things to happen within that sliver. And I said, well, okay, but what about references to those past historic moments, or the future historic moments? And they said, no, no, we have to be as oblique as possible.
Now, is this Amazon telling you this because they didn't want you to, or is this the Tolkien estate not
This is
giving
their deal with the
the
estate.
deal with the estate?
I was shocked by that deal. I was shocked because the money was astronomical. So we say, you paid this, and you can't. It's not even the Silmarillion. It's not even. And the whole scope of what happened before the Lord. Nope, it was not. So we said, okay, well, here's what you would get from a Starlight Runner. We would the first thing we would do is make you understand why the Lord of the Rings succeeded as a narrative. This is Tolkien's narrative design of the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. Because if you don't do that and don't make sure that is infused into everything to do with Rings of Power, you are going to, that means that your writing team is going to impose their version of the story onto the story. And hey, it might turn out great. And here's the line I spoke that got me killed. But you'd just be guessing. You'd just be guessing. And that insulted them. And it ended the negotiation. We don't guess, because if you guess, what you're going to do is impose see a character that you really like Sauron, and you're going to put it all into him. And then the other characters will be running around, the landscape, chasing their tails for episodes and episodes and episodes at a time.
I see. So in a way, then my love for the Sauron character and the way it's crafted, sure, it was great on the forefront, but in according to the Tolkien universe, it's completely ass backwards and terrible.
Look, it can be fine, but you have to counterbalance that conceit, because likely he was charismatic. He had to convince a bunch of people to, give him some rings, right? Forge and give him some rings. But the notion of the burden of the responsibility to keep the world at balance, to keep peace, the grappling with your soul, the fact that we are facing such dark times and times of chaos that we really wish we didn't have to, but we really have no choice but to make do with the time we are given. Those fundamental themes are hard to find in Rings of Power, and those were themes that were vital to Tolkien. So if his pain, if the things he personally was grappling with in throughout his life, all the way back to the First World War, if those are not in this work, then it's just spectacle, and it's not going to hold together thematically, and that to me is a problem for Rings of Power.
Absolutely. One last question before we shut this down. Is there a project that we'll call it a dream project, but is there an IP that you wish that you can have your hands on? Doesn't have to, it could be something that you've been working on right now, but something that you wish you had your hands on. It could be the Lord of the Rings universe, or that you're aiming to become a part of, to help transmediate and adapt the story.
Sure.
Even in 2025.
I can't talk about that because I'm negotiating it, which is awesome.
Very cool. Congratulations.
But there are a couple of other answers to the question. First of all, I teamed with Ashley Eckstein and
Star Wars. I saw that.
That's right.
Ahsoka, right?
Created a property for Disney that is truly the manifestation of some of my deepest dreams, and has something to say about myself and about the world that is for me vital to say. So, that's wonderful. I think it's going to be announced in a few months, more formally. They announced it initially, but what it is and how it works and all that sort of thing is coming up. It's not Star Wars. It's brand new thing that Ashley is very much a part of. So that is awesome, a dream come true. Leveraging the whole toolbox, in its most new and vital form. So that's great. I'd love to revisit some of the content of my youth. I love those Irwin Allen TV shows, Time Tunnel, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, Lost in Space. These crazy shows that somehow could be combined into a single universe, and made into something. The Sid and Marty Krofft, a kind of a puppet universe of H.R. Puff and stuff, and Sigmund and the monsters, all that, Bugaloos and so forth. I'd love to create a transmedia universe that revived that IP. James Bond would be awesome.
I'm so shocked they haven't. I don't know how or why they haven't. It almost seems like Hollywood, in a way, is not against transmedia or the idea of just continuing IP across multiple mediums. But I feel like with James Bond, it's like it's so blatantly obvious out there. They have so many. It's just it's so out
I did
there.
look into it, Ralph, and the thing about Barbara Broccoli, who is completely in charge of that IP, is she feels the movies are super, super special worldwide events. Anything that could dilute the potency of those movies is rough for her. But Amazon now is in possession of the rights to those movies, and they want a transmedia universe. So that is a tricky and difficult negotiation that they have with her. I think at one point an Amazon executive referred to Bond as content, and she almost had a fit.
Oh my gosh!
So it's it's there's something to be said for the specialness of a big blockbuster motion picture that comes out once every 3 years or so, but still I'd love to work on Bond.
That's awesome. Well, Jeff, I'm sure we're going to be seeing a lot more of yourself, Starlight Runner, on the projects to come. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to sit with a new Storytect and kind of break down the process. I think one key takeaway from this is like, and as you were saying, is the tool set. Each individual project, for those listening to this as well on your journey of storytelling, each project, try to add another tool to the tool belt, because at the end of the day, the more tools you have and the ability for you to go back and reach in and grab it, it just makes you that much more lethal in the industry, especially when you're creating and crafting story worlds.
100%, Ralph. And by the way, for the vast majority of my tools, I share them. I believe in knowledge abundance. I want creators to succeed in transmedia and world building and things like that. So just look me up on YouTube, and there's many videos.
Absolutely. Is there any social medias that you want the people that are listening to this to go to if they're not already following you?
From a business standpoint and technique standpoint, LinkedIn is the best for me. So I'm easy to find on LinkedIn, Jeff Gomez. The Twitter stuff, the X, I think it's called now, is a lot of Ultraman stuff, because I'm dealing with the fan base, and Facebook is kind of more personal, but LinkedIn is the best.
LinkedIn sounds good. Well, Jeff, I want to thank you again for joining the Storytects podcast. I think it's safe to say, in this world of transmedia and the world of creative production, you are at the top tier and considered one of the best Storytects we have in today's day and age. So I want to thank you so much, and look forward to talking to you in the future.
Fantastic interview. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you.